There's a book that quotes itself directly inside the New Testament that was treated as scripture by some of the earliest Christians, that survived for centuries in only one country on earth, and that most people today have never actually read and though they've heard it called forbidden. This isn't a story about a hidden code or an AI cracking some ancient cipher. This is the real story, and it's stranger than the clickbait version, because the actual history of this book is a genuine mystery about how religious canon gets decided, what got left out, and why. Es Ayet. No death is described, no burial, just an abrupt disappearance, as if he stepped out of the narrative and into somewhere else entirely. Every other patriarch in that same genealogy gets a standard formula. They lived, they had children, they died. Enoch breaks the pattern completely, and ancient readers notice that break immediately. If a righteous man could be taken directly by God without dying, what did he see up there? What hat did he learn? That single unanswered question in Genesis is the seed that grew into an entire body of literature written centuries later. Literature that tried to fill in exactly what Enoch supposedly witnessed. The result is what we now call the Book of Enoch, or more precisely, comes from Enoch, since there are two much later and largely unrelated texts, 2 Enoch and 3 Enoch, that get confused with it. 1 Enoch isn't actually one book. It's a compilation of 5 separate sections, written by different authors at different times, probably spanning from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century BCE. Scholars can tell they're separate because the WW, writing style, theology, and concerns, shift noticeably between sections. The way you can tell different authors wrote different books of an anthology, even if they're bound together under one cover. The most famous section by far, and the one almost every modern retelling focuses on, is called the Book of the Watchers. This is where things get genuinely wild, and none of it needs an AI to decode because it's just written in plain language, sitting there, translated, and says. Studied for over 2 centuries. The Watchers are angels, 200 of them according to the text, led by a figure named Semjaza, who look down at human women and decide they want them. They descend to a mountain, take an oath together, binding themselves to the plan, and then take human wives. Their offspring are the Nephilim, described as giants, some accounts putting their height at hundreds of feet, though later interpretations scale that down considerably. These Nephilim grow monstrous, consuming everything around them, eventually turning to violence and even cannibalism when regular food isn't enough. Euryale, from the Prometheus myth in Greek mythology, where a divine figure steals fire and knowledge for humanity and pays a steep price for it. Except here, the divine figures are the ones handing down the forbidden knowledge directly, and it's humanity that ends up paying the price for receiving it. God's response, according to the text, is to dispatch 4 archangels, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, to deal with the crisis. Raphael is sent to bind Azazel and throw him into a pit of darkness in the desert until Judgment Day. Michael is sent to bind Semjaza and the other Watchers, imprisoning them for 70 generations, again until the final judgment, and crucially, the flood itself. The same flood from Genesis with Noah and the Ark is framed in this text as at least partly a direct response to the Nephilim problem, a way to wipe the corrupted. The other 4 sections are less famous, but arguably just as historically important, even if they don't make for as dramatic a headline. The Book of Parables introduces a figure called the Son. He traces back to the ideas developed in this section of Enoch, written before Jesus' time. The astronomical book is a long, detailed explanation of the movements of the sun and moon and a proposed 364-day calendar, which mattered enormously to certain Jewish groups who used a different calendar than the mainstream priests stood in Jerusalem, making this section a window into real religious and political disputes over how time itself should be measured and observed. The Book of Dream Visions retells the sweep of Israelite history through an elaborate allegory where different peoples and figures, represented as animals, sheep for Israelites, wolves for oppressors, and so on. And the final section, the Epistle of Enoch, is mostly ethical instruction and warnings, promises of judgment for the wealthy and the wicked, and comfort for the righteous who suffer in the meantime. So why isn't this book in most Bibles today? This is where the actual mystery lives, and it's a much more human, much more historically grounded mystery than any AI decoding story. The book was clearly read and valued by at least some Jewish communities before Christianity even existed. We know this for certain because fragments of Enoch, written in Aramaic, were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran starting in the late 1940s. Physical manuscripts dating roughly 2,000 years, hidden away in caves near the Dead Sea. Finding those fragments confirmed something scholars had suspected for a long time, that this wasn't some late forgery, but a genuinely ancient text that circulated among serious religious communities well before the time of Jesus. Early Christianity had a genuinely complicated relationship with it. The clearest piece of direct evidence sits right inside the New Testament itself. The Epistle of Jude, a short letter near the end of the New Testament, directly quotes the Book of Enoch by name, citing a prophecy about the Lord coming with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment. That's not a vague allusion. That's a direct citation of a specific text, treated with enough authority to be quoted as prophecy in what became part of the Christian canon. Some early church fathers, including the North African theologian Tertullian around the early 3rd century, argued explicitly that Enoch should be treated as legitimate, inspired scripture, partly because the New Testament itself seemed to treat it that way. Foolery and historical references from the Hellenistic period thousands of years later. Once that authorship claim looked implausible to careful readers, its authority as genuine prophecy weakened considerably. Another reason was theological discomfort. The idea of angels literally having children with human women sat awkwardly against developing Christian theology about the nature of angels as purely spiritual beings without physical body, as capable of reproduction. As Christian doctrine matured and standardized, texts that clashed with that developing theology, however popular they'd once been, tended to get quietly excluded rather than actively banned. And exclusion is really the right word here, not banning. There's no historical record of church councils ordering copies burned or readers punished for owning it, the way some popular retellings imply. It simply stopped being copied, stopped being taught, and stopped being included when scribes assembled new manuscript collections of Scripture. Given how labor-intensive and expensive hand-copying manuscripts was in the ancient and medieval world, a text that religious authorities stopped actively promoting would naturally fade out of circulation within a few generations, not because it was destroyed, but because nobody was investing the resources to keep reproducing it. Here's the part of the story that almost never makes it into the clickbait versions, and it's honestly the most interesting part. The book didn't actually disappear everywhere. It disappeared from Western Europe and the broader Mediterranean world, where Greek and Latin Christianity dominated. But in Ethiopia, where Christianity took root extremely early, and where the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church developed its own biblical canon somewhat independently from Rome and Constantinople, the Book of Enoch was never excluded. It remained That single fact is why we have the whole book today at all. For centuries, European scholars only knew Enoch existed because of scattered quotations in other ancient texts, tantalizing references with no way to read the actual content. That Changed in 1773, when a Scottish traveler and explorer named James Bruce returned from Ethiopia carrying several manuscripts of the complete text written in Gaze. It took decades more before those manuscripts were properly translated into English, with a full scholarly translation finally published in 1821 by Richard Lawrence. For For the first time in well over 1,000 years, readers outside Ethiopia could actually read the whole thing, rather than just secondhand references to it. Since then, it's become a serious and genuinely valuable object of academic study, not because of any hidden warning, but because of what it reveals about a specific, crucial period in religious history. Scholars studying Second Temple Judaism, the centuries of Jewish relying, Jai's life between the return from Babylonian exile and the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 CE, treat Enoch as one of the most important surviving windows into how Jewish communities during that period actually thought about angels, demons, cosmic evil, and he, end of the world. Ideas that later became central to both Judaism and Christianity, the concept of a great final judgment, the idea of Satan and fallen angels as active cosmic adversaries, detailed visions of heaven and hell, all of these how up in developed form in Enoch well before they appear clearly in most of the rest of the Hebrew Bible. It's essentially a missing link, showing the theological ideas of later Judaism and early Christianity already taking shape. It also matters enormously for understanding apocalyptic literature as a genre. The whole tradition of visionary texts describing cosmic judgment and the end of the current age, a tradition that later produced texts like the Book of Daniel and eventually the Book of Revelation. Enoch is one of the earliest and most fully developed examples of that genre, and later apocalyptic writers clearly drew on its imagery, its structure, and its themes. So, what's the real, honest bottom line here, without any invented AI mystery attached to it? The Book of Enoch is a genuinely ancient, genuinely significant religious text written by multiple authors across roughly 2 centuries, quoted, approving, lie inside the actual New Testament, treated as scripture by some of the earliest Christians, later excluded from most Western biblical canons over legitimate concerns about authorship and theology, preserved completely intact for over a millennium purely because Ethiopian Christians kept copying it when nobody else did, and rediscovered by Western scholarship only in the late 1700s. Its content, angels descending to earth, forbidden knowledge, giants, a coming judgment, has been openly translated, printed, and studied by academics for 200 years now. There's no hidden LA. The loose sense that most people have simply never been told it exists, and that gap between how significant it actually is and how little most people know about it is exactly the space that clickbait ends up filling with invented mysteries instead of the real one. If you want to actually read it yourself, rather than take anyone's word for what it says, the R.H. Charles translation from the early 20th century is widely available in the public domain, and it remains one of the more careful, scholarly English translations still commonly cited today.